Nearly 2 centuries ago, Americans were packing up their belongings and moving west to settle new territories. Scores of new settlers followed the Boone's Lick Road, just about where I-70 runs. It's named after a large salt mine near Booneville that the sons of Daniel Boone operated back then. Many of those traveling the road traded supplies in Columbia along their journey. Others stopped and never left. One of the early settlers to locate here is the Lenore family, as told by one of their descendants, Garland Russell.
They arrived in 1834 from North Carolina in a large wagon. They were supposedly on their way to Lexington, Missouri. They arrived in Columbia, liked it here, were staying at what was then a local inn northeast of town. And they liked it well enough that they bought the inn, moved in, put an addition on the front of it, and that became their home, which is still standing, Greenwood.
Central Missouri had much to offer its new residents. The gently sloping land could be purchased for a reasonable amount of money, and it was rich in resources. Many of the early settlers were from Kentucky, Virginia, and other southern states. They set out to recreate the familiar Little Dixie. On November 13, 1818, a group of these settlers formed the Smithton Land Company and purchased acreage in the vicinity of the Daniel Boone Library. More than a year later, lots were for sale in the town of Smithton. Unfortunately, there were problems drilling through rock where water could be reached, so Smithton's 20 residents moved a quarter-mile east to the Flat Branch area and renamed the town Columbia. In the original plot, the Smithton Land Company set aside land for markets, a government center, and educational needs.
They made a wonderful plan for the town. The streets are parallel, the downtown. The Broadway is a broad way. It is 100 feet from over here where the faces of the buildings are to over here. The reason it was made so big was, in those days, they had livestock shows. They had to have room then for the stock pens in the middle. And so, a wide main street that's still adequate for this town.
The donation of land helped Smithton and later Columbia become the county seat. Such distinction helped to develop the town. The county court in those days took up infrastructure decisions like planning roads and issuing licenses. Judge David Todd, the uncle of President Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, presided over the first criminal case.
Mr. Steele, the court finds you guilty of fraud for dividing the scalp of a wolf into two and selling it as 2 scalps for $2. I fine you $5 for this crime committed in this here Boone County.
Court was held in a variety of locations, from under a group of sugar maples to a small cabin. The first courthouse big enough for all county operations was built in 1847. One of the town's leaders, Dr. William Jewell, decided to put the new courthouse in the middle of 8th Street. He wanted to create an avenue of the columns by placing the courthouse entrance directly facing the front of the new academic hall on the other end of 8th Street. Jewell is also credited with the inscription that graced the front entry. Both the columns and the inscription were saved when the present-day courthouse was built. Columbia became a center for education. Banding together with the passion of a political campaign, the town's 13,000 or so residents donated land and raised a little more than $118,000 to establish the university here. Their hard work paid off when the cornerstone for the university was laid on July 4, 1840. However, building a viable major learning center was not without its setbacks.
My grandfather, F.H. Russell, was there the night that Academic Hall burned. He was living in the family home at Providence and Broadway at that time, and had gone up for a performance at the university that evening when the building caught fire. And what was particularly impressive to him was watching as the building burned. The windows were all double hung. And as the fire intensified, the glass would break out. And so the windows would fly open. And there were windows flying open all over the building while it burned. Then as the fire progressed, the window cords would burn through and the windows would fall shut again. So all this time the windows were going up and down and up and down. And people were going in and carrying out what they could, anybody from town that was there. And he particularly remembered there was a stuffed tiger somewhere on an upper story. And somebody got the tiger by his tail and dragged him down the stairs and through the hall and out the door, and by the time they got him out, there was almost no fur left on that tiger.
There were a number of people in the legislature who wanted to move the university to other places to get it out of Columbia. It didn't have a good railroad. It was a small town. It didn't have a good fire department and water system, which is one reason the building burned completely. Boone Countyans and Columbians again had to come up with a lot of money to convince the state legislature that the university should stay here. And the town also had to build a modern waterworks so that if another fire happened, with hydrants and so on, so that if another fire happened, the buildings could be saved. In the early 20th century, they called us the Athens of Missouri, not just because of the university and its columns, but also because of the other two colleges and a good public school system. This is where people went in the state of Missouri for learning. This was Athens. This was not Sparta. The warriors weren't here, but the learners and the book writers and the libraries and so on were here.
You of the present time can never appreciate the sacrifices and hardships of your ancestors, can never magnify and privation laid the foundation of our present life in Boone County. James L. Stevens.
The prosperity of the country rests peculiarly upon the prosperity of agriculture.
At the turn of the century, Columbia's prosperity depended upon education and agriculture. This concerned the young editor of the Columbia Herald, who became the first dean of the journalism school, and by 1930, president of the University of Missouri, Walter Williams.
As a citizen of the community, he did amazing things. He helped to found the Commercial Club, which is what they call the first version or early version of the Chamber of Commerce. And it was very active. He helped to bring a factory to town. Columbians we're talking 1904, 1905, 1906, felt the town's economy was very unbalanced. It was a farm service center, it was an academic center, obviously, but there were no factory jobs for people, and young people were leaving Columbia for St. Louis, for Kansas City, for Sedalia, where they could find such jobs. So there was a big campaign in 1906 to bring a shoe factory to town, a branch of the biggest shoe company in the country, the Hamilton Brown Company. The building still stands. Columbians built the factory building for the company. They built a rail line, a spur railroad line to get railroad cars to the factory itself. They were fighting then for a place on the main highway, what became US 40 and then what eventually became I-70. Walter Williams headed up the effort to get Columbia placed on this major highway. There were no federal funds in 1911. There were no state funds, or very few state funds. So it was a local effort. Towns coming up with money and sending out road graders, or what we would call road graders, to level off a hill. We were never a railroad town. There was never a railroad running through Columbia. We still have the two buildings that were railroad depots, but railroad trains backed into them or came to a dead end stop and then had to go back toward the river for the MKT and for the Wabash and go up to Centralia. So when we became a highway town, the town had a much better chance to grow.
In 1905, the first automobile arrived in Columbia. There was a lot of skepticism that this horseless carriage would be anything more than a fad from its debut at the World's Fair in St. Louis. A Studebaker cost over $1,000, pricey for most Columbians. Few roads were good to drive on. Often, a horse or mule had to pull out cars stuck in the mud. But once the first garage and auto agencies were opened, more townsfolk gave in to this fad. The Columbia Automobile Company announced it sold 100 cars in 4 months. In 1911, the City Council passed an ordinance regulating motor vehicles in town.
Any car meeting a horse-drawn vehicle must be brought to a halt and its engine stopped if the noise frightens the animal.
A young Boone County girl, Sue Gerard, remembers an early experience in her family's Model T Ford.
You had to crank it, and it was hazardous, and you were taught to hold the crank in the hand and not have the thumb around the crank, but the thumb and the crank was on top of the thumb. And you had to crank this way without the thumb over there or to break this arm. And my brother had that happen to him. But when I went to have my tonsils out, we went to Jefferson City. I remember Mother was cranking the Ford to do that, you know.
Sue grew up on a dairy farm. She fondly recalls carrying her own pint-sized bottle to where the cows were being milked, taking sips on the way back to her house.
I think that Dad's cows probably grazed on the Stevens College golf course, the north part. He didn't have a big dairy. A dairy in those days was 8 to 12 cows.
Having lost her home to a fire as a child, the family rebuilt their farm and life continued, with Saturday trips to town to buy groceries and a visit to Hayes Hardware.
Dad had to go for nuts and bolts and chains and Mother for lamp chimneys and things like that, and that was on Broadway. On Saturdays, farmers had more or less the work is done, go buy the groceries for the weekend, and maybe some special thing like an ice cream cone or a bag of candy. We weren't really terribly poor, but we always knew that Dad had the interest to pay. And we did lots of things that were free.
Anderson Logan also remembers early life, growing up in Columbia.
We didn't have refrigerators. We had what was known as icebox. And we had the ice wagon come through, and he would sell ice. He'd go from street to street and hollering, ice man, and then you buy ice from him. And then we didn't have electricity, so it used to be a Kohler wagon come through. Yeah, for lamps, so you can buy your coal oil, put in those lamps.
Life at the turn of the century was not easy, especially trying to deal with Missouri weather. As Mark Twain said, if you don't like Missouri weather, wait a minute. Not only can the weather change at the drop of a hat, but we also have our share of extreme temperatures. Just take November 11th, 1911.
By 3 o'clock, an Arctic cold front had swept through central Missouri, and the temperature at Columbia dropped from 82 degrees to 38 degrees. So there was a 44-degree temperature drop in 1 hour, which has never been done before. That was by far established a largest temperature drop in an hour for Columbia. And by midnight that night, the temperature was 13 degrees. So we went from a high of 82 degrees at 2 o'clock to a low of 13 degrees by midnight, which was a 69-degree temperature drop for Columbia. And that also, the 13 degrees, was a record low temperature. So in the same day, Columbia set a record high and a record low. And that has never been established ever in current records.
While Columbia saw growth and a good economy in the early part of the century, it still had its tragedies. One of the darkest moments in our town's history took place in 1923, when an African-American man by the name of James T. Scott was lynched on the Stewart Road Bridge.
They did it at a nighttime. They broke into jail. They said that he raped a white woman. They drove this man from the jail to the bridge. They put a rope down the Stewart Bridge. They put a rope around his neck and hung him off the bridge. But he was the wrong man that they hung. And the man that they found later, after they done hung him, as they found later, they caught this man. But this man was going with this woman, and she just got caught. It was a terrible time. People was all upset, and people were crying, both white and black. The next day, you couldn't hear nothing. Everything was just quiet.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Columbia's black neighborhoods remained in the grasp of old 19th century customs as white neighborhoods in town began to move into a 20th century lifestyle. Within a decade or two, Columbians who were white mostly enjoyed improved streets, running water, flush toilets, electricity, and other conveniences. Yet stiff competition by European immigrants, low wages, and chronic unemployment made it difficult for African Americans to afford these modern conveniences. Thus, Columbia began to split into two separate communities, each with very different cultural patterns. Still, there were exceptions. One of the most successful businessmen in Columbia, John Lang, committed his resources to the education of African Americans.
John Lang and some of those folks were the ones who developed a school program for the African American community in Columbia. So it was started from the church. It was Douglas School started from the church. It started off as in his home, in John Lang's home, as a matter of fact.
In 1916, Columbia voters approved a $35,000 bond issue for a new school for blacks. It was named in honor of Frederick Douglass, a runaway slave who became a well-known leader in the abolitionist movement. Over time, Douglass School became a prime example of the separate but equal policy, as the well-funded white schools in town developed at a much faster rate.
One of the early cases that helped lead up to the Brown decision was decided through Missouri and the University of Missouri, the Gaines case that most people have heard of. And that was an important first step in the Supreme Court's gradually moving toward the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So Missouri played a prominent role, at least in the beginnings of the movement toward the desegregation of public education.
During the 30s, Lincoln University student Lloyd Gaines applied to MU's law school for admission. However, Missouri did not allow blacks and whites to attend the same school, and there was no other law school in the state for blacks. So Gaines and the NAACP sued the state. Eventually, the case ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that a state could not provide a type of education for one class of its citizens and not another. The ruling did not call for desegregation. Rather, it ruled that a state must offer equal legal education. So Missouri agreed to open a law school under Lincoln University to be located in St. Louis. But before the first law student enrolled, Lloyd Gaines disappeared.
There's a mystery as to what happened to Lloyd Gaines, and the family and most African Americans I talked to when I first got to town, older people, many of whom are now deceased, said that, of course, yeah, they got him.
Columbia's black community endured difficult times of segregation and discrimination, but one of their own became a rising star, the world-renowned ragtime pianist J.W. Blind Boone.
Mr. Boone was our guest in our home. I was just a little in awe because he was such a big man. Number one, he was such a big man. Number two, also, he was a blind man.
In the summertime, he would have a festival for the kids in the community. And he would play the piano and we would march all around the room.
Today, plans are underway to restore Blind Boone's home.
Stretching my imagination, he would just be pleased to what Columbia is now doing, and pleased that someone thought enough of this great man to preserve his building and to perhaps keep some of his dreams alive.
As Shakespeare says, if music be the breath of love, play on.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified.
We've had a vision, and we've worked for it, and we've seen it through.
By 1931, Columbia's business community was hard hit by the Depression. The Hamilton Brown Shoe Company closed its factory that year. The university was hit harder than the private colleges in town, since state appropriations were reduced greatly.
I know where I was the day they said the stock market has crashed. Well, here I'm a farm girl, and stock are animals that run around in the field. The stock market has crashed. Well, I thought the cattle market had crashed. I didn't know what it meant. Didn't have any idea what it meant. But I know where I was in the University High School on a front window looking out from the second floor out towards 6th Street. And I knew everybody was much upset about this.
Surprisingly, though, Stevens College grew by leaps and bounds during the 30s because it came up with some innovative programs and it did a good job of recruiting. And people, I guess, were looking more and more for places to send their daughters for at least a 2-year education above high school.
Columbia became a hotbed of sorts during the suffrage movement within the state. Much support came from the two women's colleges. Women, like Christian College President Luella St. Clair Moss, campaigned to bring women the right to vote. In fact, Boone County Democrats elected St. Clair Moss to win the primary as the first female congressional candidate from Missouri, only to lose the House seat to Republican Sidney Roach in November.
For many, many years there were two women's colleges in town. They did call them girls' schools, but they were women's colleges. They did compete with each other. The Stevens students were known as Susies. The Christian girls were known as Cathys. As a matter of fact, they competed in all kinds of ways, I'm sure, informally for dates at the university for men, but in all kinds of other ways too. Cultural programming, for example. I think if one had a fine singer come to campus, that was one up on the other one.
They were not permitted to leave the campus without hat, shoes, and gloves. I remember when we could tell the girls at church or in the store, we could say, "Ah, that's a Christian college girl."
The university excluded women in the early years, so families wanting to educate their daughters established two colleges in Columbia with the support of religious organizations in the 1850s. Christian Female College found support from Christians and later became Columbia College. Stevens College, on the other hand, was founded by the Baptists, looking for a religious orientation different from the Christians. Much later, the colleges opened their doors to men, while the emphasis on religion diminished as women from all kinds of spiritual backgrounds enrolled. Lots of stories have been handed down over the years of college life. One in particular is about the ghost of Senior Hall at Stevens. It's been told and retold through the century, and its versions have changed, depending upon who you talk to.
One was a Civil War story, where the Union, usually a Union soldier had been wounded. He made his way, crawled somehow into the Senior Hall, or it wasn't called that then, but into the house that was the core of Senior Hall. The student found him, nursed him back to health, supposedly in one of the towers. They married or ran off together in some way or another, and the most usual story was they drowned in what may have been the Hinkson Creek, which was flooding at the time.
During the 30s, Columbia bought the Alton Airfield, dedicating the new municipal airport located at what now is Cosmo Park.
My uncle Opal Martin, his nickname was Okie. Everybody called him Okie. And he was one of the first people in Columbia to get involved in flying. He was with the Alton brothers that had the Alton Automobile Agency. I remember one time when we used to go out and watch him fly, and then one day he wanted to take us up, the kids up, and my mom wouldn't let us go. I was about 6 years old, and I never did forgive her, and I never got up in an airplane till 60 years later.
They were called the Flying Susies, young women from all over the country enrolled in a unique program offered through Stevens College. These aviation students were housed at the old Sinclair Hotel across from the airport. As World War II approached, the college trained pilots to support the war effort as well as other kinds of flying.
And I would see these girls all walking across the highway to take their flying lessons. I thought that was really neat, you know. It was a nice airport. 2 paved runways, if I remember right. Nice set of buildings, had a good fixed-based operator, Cottonwoods. Francis In-law met him, he was a flight instructor, and they had quite a few students. It was pretty active then. Not a big airport, but a nice airport.
Columbia native Joan Davidson began flying during the 1950s. As a young girl, she always looked toward the skies.
This would have happened back in the very early 30s. I was very young. Always interested in airplanes, that's why I remembered it. There was a plane, an airmail plane that crashed out here on the embankment. This road was built up and it was quite high. It went into the embankment, I guess, during the night. And a Central Dairy truck came down the road early the next morning and found where it had crashed. The letters from the mail pouch were scattered into the trees across the highway, just like it had snowed into the trees. That's the part I remember so much, was all the letters hanging in the tree from the wreckage.
Ninth Street was Theater Row with the Varsity, the Hall, and later the Missouri. The Cozy Theater was on Broadway. Much later there was the Boone Theater on 8th Street. It was a very small house. And then the Uptown Theater on Broadway.
Longtime residents recall the first silent movie shown at the Missouri Theater, featuring Buster Keaton with music from the theater's magnificent pipe organ, just before talkies became the rage.
The opening night had the Rocket Girls of St. Louis, I think was their name. There were 6 women, and they later went on to bigger and better things in the theater world in New York and became the Radio City Music Hall Rockettes. During the period of time that they had vaudeville acts here at the theater, there was another fellow in a dancing chorus by the name of Leslie Towns Hope, later became the comedian Bob Hope.
The theater is now home to the Missouri Symphony Society, founded in 1970 by Columbians Hugo and Lucy Vianello. Since that time, the symphony has been raising money to restore the Missouri Theater.
The facade that you see along 9th Street, that was added in the 50s. That will all be removed, and as far as we know, much of the original terracotta and brick remain behind that. So the box office area will also all be changed. The entryway was modernized in the 50s, and that will be put back. We've come a long way. I think people don't realize how much has been done. I think as with construction on a home or anything else, you take care of the infrastructure first. We've had to do roof repairs. Building has been tuck pointed. There was one corner of the building, and it was raining very heavily back on the corner of the stage house. Water would run down the inside of the walls. So.
In 1999, Columbia electrician Michael Kennedy donated his time, spending many hours restoring the Italian-made chandelier. After cleaning, painting, and replacing broken glass, the theater unveiled its restored chandelier as supporters watched from the stage.
I think for me it all came together then. We've got a long way to go, but that was one of the major steps, I think. It shows what can be done with the building. It's a real gem and a real important part of life in Columbia, cultural life, and we want to do everything that we can to preserve it.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I think we'll win out. We'll win out.
During World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt made a tour through mid-Missouri. The First Lady was intrigued by what Columbia offered its young people on the home front. With so many servicemen training in Columbia, there was a need for something fun to do. So Parks and Recreation set up a gathering place in the basement of a vacant church. Local teens did much of the work themselves and named it Teen Town.
In her tour around, they mentioned Teen Town, and she wanted to go. She wrote about this. She wrote a column, My Day, Here's What I Did Today. And that was published in every paper in the nation. After she wrote about Teen Town, letters flooded in. The desk was piled with letters. Tell us how you did this. Tell us what to do. How are we going to do it? And Teen Town sprouted up everywhere.
Columbians on the home front were very much part of the war effort. Troops did training here. Life pretty much revolved around what was happening overseas. Even Italian prisoners of war held in Columbia sang in the choir loft at Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Sundays.
Get on the road to victory, get off, get off.
Well, we had rationing. These are the times we lived through. They said you could only buy so much sugar a month, and they gave you a stamp, and it wasn't like the food stamps now. These were stamps that said you only bought 5 pounds of sugar a week, no matter how many children you had. You only bought so much flour, so much lard, so much so-and-so. And that was all you had. They primarily used the stamps for everyone. They were for everybody.
They had buses come from Fort Leonard Wood, bringing a lot of soldiers to the dances. Some of them made lifetime friends. Then the college would send the girls down to Fort Leonard Wood to their dances. And they did the same with Kemper and MMA and others.
Well, probably the wars, especially World War II, had more impact than the Depression did on the university because all the men being drafted. The university suddenly became something of a women's college because so many men were going or about to go into the military.
Familiar places in town, like Booch's Billiards, continued much the same, reminding our returning heroes that life is normal again. Columbian Paul Venable opened a pool hall on Broadway in 1884. As the story goes, Paul got his infamous nickname from the poet Eugene Fields, a former student at the university. While growing up in town, 7-year-old Paul met Fields while hanging out on campus.
And he liked kids, so he struck up a conversation and he says, "What's your name, little boy?" And he replied, "Paul Blucher Venable." And the poet said, that's no name for a little boy. From now on, you go by Booch and Booch only. And this nickname stuck. And apparently, according to Booch's daughter, Field continued to correspond with Booch, sent him first editions of all his books, and they remained lifelong friends.
In the early part of the century, Booch's was in its heyday, very much a men's club. However, Booch was known to entertain ladies for afternoon tea in the pool hall. Later, when he sold his place, the next owners did not welcome women, and it stayed that way for a long time. It had 22 pool tables, a barber shop, and an eating area, taking up the entire second floor of the Virginia Building, located across the street from its current 9th Street location.
Most of the pool tables, I believe, were from the early turn of the century. They're in good playing shape now, but they are 100 years old. They might roll a little bit this way or that way sometimes.
Columbia authorities strictly enforced the ban on alcohol during Prohibition. Stories are told that a group of university professors would drive to Jefferson City each week to purchase their illegal hooch.
Well, they were affected like everybody else. There's always the story. There's a very small room in the basement. There are quite a few stories of crap games and drinking going on down there. The one story is there's like a trap door on it, and whenever the local police were seen to be coming close, whoever was near the trap door would just start jumping up and down on it to signal to quiet down and make like nobody's there. That's probably the best one of that period.
The old regulars at Booch's are not forgotten. Long after they pass through here, small plaques are a reminder of special friends.
There's not as many smokers in here as it used to be, and it used to be when you came in and looked down and all you saw was the layers of smoke in the back, and that's your ghosty appearance. And probably the most unfortunate thing that's happened since we bought Booch's is the old retired guys that were everyday customers have passed away. So it's not hard for your imagination to see them and see the smoke and hear some things that I see them. I don't know if they're ghosts, but I see my old friends, yeah.
Just a few doors down from Booch's, another Columbia icon, Tiger Barbershop, has its chairs filled, swapping stories of the news in town.
When I first came to Columbia, we had a sheriff here in Columbia by the name of Glenn Powell. And he was a very friendly person and knew everyone in town, everyone knew him. And he had a beard that was really, really tough. And people would see him coming, and barbers would start taking breaks, and loafing so someone else would get him. Not that they didn't like him, but his beard was so tough that it was, people used to say it's like shaving a boar hog, It just, but he was a well-respected sheriff, and everybody in town liked him. At that time, we had 7 barbershops on 9th Street alone. And I think they employed, the 7 barbershops had about 32 barbers in them. Barbershops started to go out of business, I can't remember the year, but when the Beatles came to town and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, they had the long hair, and that's when the barber business started a big decline. And the only thing that kept us alive was the other barbershops closing, and other people, we get a few from each barbershop that closed. And now the Tiger Barbershop is the only barbershop on 9th Street.
Columbia is proud of its downtown shopping district. The Columbia Retail Merchants Association feels its slogan, "What do you want to buy? What do you want to pay?" Columbia has it every day, well describes the most complete shopping center between Kansas City and St. Louis. Since Columbia,
Downtown Columbia continued to be the center of commerce and shopping until malls sprung up and the town grew larger.
Well, in those days, you knew all your customers almost. Well, then another thing we do to help, because they got paid on then on Friday. So when they did that, when Dad would go down to the bank, yeah, he'd get a lot of money because the banks weren't open in the afternoon. So they'd come in, just get their checks so they could buy something.
I can remember that the streets were all brick, very uneven. There were so many dips that you had to drive slowly or the undercarriage of your car would drag on the streets. And I remember that we had a lot of women's dress shops. There were several of them on Broadway. I remember that all the businessmen at that time were wearing suits and ties every day. That was the order. And even the students. The fraternity boys, I don't think were allowed downtown unless they had a coat and tie on. Most of the students would wear a white shirt and a tie every day.
And see, when I was growing up, we had a lot of black kids. We had Miss Jenny Taylor, who would be right here at the base of the overpass. She had a restaurant. You could go in there and buy candy, a sandwich, a soda, and things like that. And you had Blue and White Cafe. You had Mr. Richardson, who done shoes, Richardson Shoe Shop, right down here on 3rd Street. Later on in years, you'd go around the corner and you had Braga Chicken. And it was a place where you go and buy the biggest tenderloin sandwich you could find in Boone County.
And of course, urban renewal affected some of them, you know, in terms of applying for loans to relocate and so forth was not readily available to many of those black businesses. So businesses were terminated as a result of urban renewal.
Because they saw us as a society.
Well, I like to tell people that when I went into the Army in the spring of 1966, I felt that I left in the age of Eisenhower. Even though Lyndon Johnson was president and John F. Kennedy had just been assassinated, Columbia still felt very 1950-ish to me. When I returned in the spring of 1968 from Vietnam, I felt like I was entering a brand new community and actually a new world. In my absence, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. The civil rights movement had exploded. And I come back into the middle of all this. So I leave in the age of Eisenhower. I come back to the age of acid, rock and roll, people fighting at the dinner table, and at the same time a tremendous economic boom, a brand new Columbia. What a terrible, horrible time to have come of age. And at the same time, what a wonderful time. It was amazing.
Started school at the university in 1966 and lived in the Paquin Wall area. Walking along this street to go to class and feeling like I must have been in Haight-Ashbury or Greenwich Village because the smells and sounds of it were so different. First walk down the street, I started smelling curry and hearing Ravi Shankar playing and feeling I was longer than 60 miles away from Hermann, Missouri. It would be the sounds of bells, wind chimes, and folk singers strumming out their latest imitation of Dylan or Simon and Garfunkel, and I would say the odor of marijuana was pretty prevalent as you were walking down the street. That it was just an out-of-place feeling for a small town kid let loose in the big city of Columbia.
A very exciting place. You remember the 60s and early 70s was really a period of ferment. And a part of my coming was all of the idealism that the students had, and they were pretty much forcing, in a way, the faculty and administration to follow suit.
This period also saw urban renewal, which brought about mixed feelings among residents in the neighborhood surrounding Douglas School. Impoverished homes with dirt floors and no indoor plumbing in the black community underwent drastic changes in 1956.
Urban renewal in one respect was a blessing, in another way it was a curse. It was a blessing in that it provided better living facilities. Streets were improved also, but looking at it from a negative point of view, many of those residents that was affected by urban renewal owned their own homes. And of course the sum that they received from the sale of that house or relinquishing that house to urban renewal was not adequate to obtain a loan for a new or a better home. And some of those people had reached the age of where they did not qualify for loans. And so they were forced to move within public housing, which for a person to have labored 40 or 50 years and purchase a home and to relinquish that home was very traumatic.
As Columbia became a more diverse community, diners helped to bring people from all walks of life together. Places like Ernie's and Broadway Diner have stood the course of time, while restaurant chains took hold and began catering to travelers along the highway.
In some ways, the diner has remained the same as it always has been, which was why they were so popular at the beginning, because of the closeness of the community and the warmth feeling that you attain from eating in a diner. Everybody knows everybody's name. My lease expires in 2 years, and then we will physically pick up the building and relocate it and continue on in business in Columbia. Every town needs a diner.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I remember our opening night, we were both real scared, and you know, opening nights usually go okay, you know, people want to come out and check it out and stuff like that. But, you know, it took a lot of development.
The same year MTV came into the homes of nearly every family with teenagers, the Blue Note opened their doors to a new style of live music. The year was 1980.
We swept the floors, we mopped, you know, we didn't do a great job. Didn't want to get it too clean, but, you know, we bartended, we did sound, we did all that stuff, and once again, you're interacting with people, and at that point in time, it was just, you know, it was things like the Violent Femmes, you know, you would never see in Columbia, Missouri, but we brought them in, things like that.
The Blue Note eventually moved into the old Varsity Theater on 10th Street, giving the downtown nightlife a little more life. Famous musicians have made a stop here, as well as local and regional bands.
99% of them are just regular folks that just enjoy what they do and know that you enjoy what they do. And they're really not asking for anything special. In fact, the more famous they are, the less they ask. You know, it's like Johnny Cash. I remember when Johnny Cash showed up here, I don't even think he asked for dinner or any of that kind of stuff. They might have asked for some water and some towels on stage, and that was about it. One thing about Columbia is there are a lot of music lovers.
Even though Columbians have benefited from technology throughout the century, the 1990s remind us that we are still at the mercy of Mother Nature. In 1993, the rain came and never seemed to stop. Towns along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers were fighting to keep the river at bay. Columbians spent countless hours sandbagging, helping to save nearby towns and protecting the city's water treatment plant in McBain.
During that first crest, the water, for the first time in our history, in our at that time, about 25, 26 year history of operation, we had water enter the main plant area, and it got to a depth in some places of about 12 inches. The river went back down. We have that feeling of relief, and then a few days later, the Department of Natural Resources and the Corps of Engineers tells us the river's coming again. This time it may be 5, 6 feet higher. Unbelievable. We rode out about 3 weeks of the worst floods in human memory.
In terms of the largest snowfall we've ever had, that occurred just a few years ago, back in 1995. Specifically, it was January 19th, 1995, when Columbia reported 20 inches of snow within a 24-hour period.
Another major weather event occurred toward the end of the century. An F3 tornado with winds around 150 miles per hour swept through the southwest part of Columbia. It was much greater than previous tornadoes on record in 1931, 1973, and 1990. Amazingly, no one was killed.
And I opened my bedroom door, and it's like I was standing in my front yard. I was like everything, our whole front of our house was gone. I mean, I was just standing there.
Well, we just retired here 4 years ago from Northern California, and we went through the earthquake up there where the Oakland Bay Bridge collapsed, and this is far, far worse, believe me. I always said I'd take an earthquake over a tornado, and I really believe it now.
With 3 record-breaking weather events in 1 decade, some Columbians wondered if we were headed into a new century of extremes.
I don't necessarily think there's been an increase in severe weather or extremes, because when we look back through the record books, there are some periods back in the late 1800s and the 1900s where we still do have records standing from extremes, be it temperature or precipitation or storm events. It's just Missouri is an unusual place in terms of experiencing all sorts of weather, and it's the natural variability of the climate system where we are exposed to these extremes from time to time.
Farmers depend on Mother Nature probably greater than most occupations. The latter part of the century saw much change in our agriculture, with the farm crisis wreaking havoc on the Midwest since the 1980s. As the land-grant university, Columbia has always been a place of learning to improve Missouri and the nation's agriculture, and we've taken pride in one of Columbia's own fields that began in the fall of 1888. Agriculture Dean J.W. Sanborn saw the value of crop rotation back east and wanted to demonstrate its value to Missourians. More than a century later, Sanborn Field is the 3rd oldest continuous research field in the Western world.
I think it's got a lot of uniqueness in the fact that the plots that are immediately behind me have had the same treatment. The one I'm essentially standing on, 6 tons of barnyard manure every year. The one further behind that, nothing added. So you've got the historic aspect of something that cumulative keeps adding to our knowledge base.
Plot 23 is significant in the field of medicine, and it still grows in the middle of Sanborn Field. Soil samples taken from this plot in 1945 allowed a former MU instructor, Dr. Benjamin Duggar, to discover the drug oreomycin from organisms found in the soil.
It's the leader in the first generation of the antibiotics that came about in World War II. It was used primarily, as I read the records, in the South Pacific to fight infection there. It's used more now in production agriculture.
A sample of Plot 23 is at the Smithsonian Institution. Today, that same plot continues to grow in timothy grass, with nothing added to its soil since it began. No one has spent as much time over the years studying Sanborn Field as Professor Emeritus Dr. C.M. Woodruff. Woody, as he is known in town, came to the university as a student in 1928 and got his first job with the Soils Department. Woody continues to do research in the field, coming here nearly every day. One of the most memorable events happened in 1950. That's when Sanborn Field topped 100 bushels an acre, becoming one of the first fields to do so.
After we started growing 100 bushel corn per acre here, the first few field days that we had, farmer field days, we had 2,000 farmers come in for our field days. They were all interested in what we were doing, and they took it home and used it, you know.
There's been some pressures in the past to say, hey, why can't we take Sanborn Field and make a parking lot or put a fast food restaurant at the corner? That would be a big money maker. And so I think one of the things that's consistent has been the persistence on the part of dedicated and committed individuals to keep this thing going as an outdoor laboratory.
Researchers at Sanborn Field say their work will be useful as we move into the next millennium. It's a marker of what we are doing to the land and the environment.
We're taking a look at atmospheric inputs due to man's intervention that maybe we can document. We feel we've got a unique battery of samples with past management that can play a very strong role in some of the clues and trends there.
As we look toward a new century, we reflect on our lives and how Columbians who've gone before us have helped shape our community. From a village and town to a small city, Columbia has become a diverse place to live, strong in education, medical care, and commerce. By passing the torch to a new generation, we hope for an even better Columbia in the next millennium.